Hello. Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to welcome everyone who is watching us live. This is the final panel of our event, the Worldwide Developers Conference Against Apple Censorship. And this panel is about publishing iOS apps when censored. So what we are going to be discussing in this panel is about looking at like how Apple censors app and what that actually means for the two stakeholders, the developers and the end users. And we will also be focusing on another aspect of it, which is looking at what are the solutions, or are there solutions? So I know there are solutions, but I'm just kind of like saying, what are the other solutions when Apple blocks an app? Or is there a way to change the current ecosystem of Apple so that something better can be done? So yeah, without getting into too much details on what the panelists are going to be talking about, let me just invite in the panelists. So first of all, I would like to introduce the panelists. We have Nathan, who actually wears a lot of different hats. So Nathan is the director of technology for Tibet Action Institute, as well as the founder and the director of the Guardian Project, which develops open source apps. Then we have Charlie Smith, who's a co-founder for GreatFire, and GreatFire monitors censorship in China, and they have been doing that since 2011. And along with that, they do a website called Apple Censorship and a lot of other work related to what's happening inside China. Then we also have hkmap.life, the developer from that group. And I think most of us know what hkmap.life is. It was a map developed to support the protesters in Hong Kong and how it was banned. And not the least, I would also like to acknowledge Tenzin Samtin, who's a Tibetan app developer, and he's a co-founder of the Dutch technology group. And he and his team have developed apps for the Tibetan government in exile, Tibetan media apps, and a few other apps as well. So thank you all for being on the panel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And so before I go forward, I wanted to bring into the light two things. So as you can see from the panel, like from our stream, you can see me, you can see Nathan, you can see something. But then you see two logos, right? One is the GreatFire logo and one is the hkmap.life logo. And the reason why you're seeing a logo and not their faces is the fact that there is actual risk of people working on this, especially if you have family or if you are living in some of those areas. So for privacy and security, both GreatFire and hkmap, the representatives for both, will not be being on camera. However, I have their statements and I will be reading the statements on their behalf. And at the same time, I'll be reading their answers, especially to questions on their behalf. I know this is a bit different, but however, I think it is very important to bring voices of those who are working on this, especially the challenges that they are facing on a personal basis, and highlight the great work that they're doing, even though they can't be and show who they are and to even take credit for their own work. So yeah, I just wanted to say that before we move into the session. Yes, okay. So in terms of the sessions, we're going to start with Charlie from GreatFire, and I'll be reading his statement to start with. And I think Nathan, before we go there, Nathan was saying, yeah, you might also see some of Nathan's children from time to time, just so people.
We're still in a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic. They're still in school. I'm doing my best. So, real life, everyone.
Thank you, Nathan. Thanks for being here, and we understand. Yes. So I'm going to be reading GreatFire's statement, and people can read along. So this is from Charlie Smith. We started GreatFire in 2011 to help bring transparency to how censorship works in China. We have projects that provide information about what websites are blocked in China, and we have projects that help to tackle censorship on platforms inside China. We have also developed our own anti-censorship tool, Free Browser. AppleCensorship.com was created to address a lack of transparency around app removals and censorship. It compares availability of apps by country. GreatFire.org's idea for AppleCensorship.com came after one of its own apps was censored in app stores on a global basis. AppleCensorship.com was created to address a lack of transparency around app removals and censorship. It compares availability of apps by country. Apple works closely with authoritarian countries like China to censor their app stores. More often than not, the apps that authorities ask to be removed are apps that help everyday people protect their privacy and communicate securely with each other. In China alone, Apple has removed more than 1,000 VPN apps, making it virtually impossible for Chinese to access uncensored information. But Apple censors more than VPN apps. Data from AppleCensorship.com indicates that almost 3,000 apps which are available in other markets are not available in China. These are not just VPN apps, but apps that focus on a wide range of subjects, including civil society, mainstream news, LGBTQ rights, and religious freedom. This isn't just about freedom of expression. When we choose apps to protect our privacy, we need to be able to hold developers accountable when they fail. Developers know we will choose another app. Apple's actions ensure that their customers can only choose apps that have been approved by the state. Apple continues to claim that they believe that privacy is a fundamental human right. But every day, Apple denies this right to millions of their customers around the world. When governments ask tech companies to put people at risk for exercising their right to freedom of expression, it is the responsibility of tech company CEOs like Tim Cook to say no. Apple's response has always been to say yes. Apple will never follow through on their obligations to defend freedom of expression and privacy if there is no sustained pressure from civil society. Pressure that is created from events like today's. Apple's response thus far has been to release transparency reports claiming that the majority of the apps removed violate App Store policies on obscenity and gambling. Data from AppleCensorship.com shows that this is simply not true. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. And so, next, I actually would like to refer to something. If you can talk a bit about, the apps that you have developed and why do you think those are important? And also a bit about like when you were developing and got banned for some of those apps, what was the process like?
Sure. Thanks. So basically, when we, as a developer, when we develop an app for two major mobile and OS, which is Android and iOS, and if we talk in terms of our Tibetan community, if we can say that around 60% of Tibetan community in exile is using a iPhone, and almost 10 to 20% of people inside Tibet. So, which makes us very important to develop an app which is in the iOS applications to reach out the majority of our populations. So, basically, now what happens is I can say in terms of my application, there are a few applications which I have developed, and I will tell how it was censored and it was not able to reach the App Store. So the process goes is like if you're an iOS developer, basically what you have to do is you have to first buy a Apple developer account. So after that, you sign your application, and after that, what you have to do is you have to send the application to be reviewed by the Apple. So what happens is usually this review system takes around 4 to 6 working days. So for me, after giving the app, which is Tibet.net, which is for the Central Tibetan Administration, I wait for around 6 days. And after 6 days, I got a mail saying that my app has been rejected from the Chinese App Store because of some illegal contents inside the application, which was totally, I was not sure why it is illegal. Then after that, they said that, and they have mentioned that if you want to go against it, you can go to the lawyers and get to know about it and put a legal action about it. which was totally out of my hand. So nothing was done, and the application was not available in the Chinese App Store. So apart from that, but for all other territories, the application was available. So which makes it which raised me for two major things that was not, I felt like it's not the way, because Apple is, for me, I expect the Apple to be a platform which is unbiased platform in which you can express yourself and innovate yourself, and which is completely not happening on the Apple side. And the second thing is there was no, when they rejected the application, there was no explanation and the documentation of why the application was rejected and how I can go through so that the app can be accepted to the App Store. So there was no information regarding all those stuff, which makes us very tough or almost impossible to get to the Chinese App Store. So I would urge them to be more transparent in terms of regarding the review of the applications, so that more and more applications can go through the Chinese App Store, and people can get more information about what's happening out there. Thanks. That's all I have.
Thank you, Something. So yeah, I have some questions, but I'm just going to wait for the Q&A section.
Sure.
Discussion. So next, I would like to go to HK Live and HK Map, and I'm going to be reading your statement, which was because I did ask HK Map a few questions in the beginning. Was like, what is HK Map about, and how does it help the citizens in Hong Kong? What was the impact for you as a developer? And yes, so that's what I wanted to ask HK Map earlier, and this is a statement. So I'm going to read that now. Yes. Okay. HK Map is a site that supports Hong Kong protests by providing real-time crowdsourced geolocation data of groups of police, protesters, deployed tear gas, warning flags, and more. We gathered data from user submissions and verified them using trusted ground crew, live broadcasts, Telegram channels, etc. Since our launch on August 5th, we covered almost every protest everywhere in Hong Kong. We peaked at over 200K unique users daily in early October, and mobile users accounted for more than half of it. Our users include passerby, protesters, journalists, tourists, and even government supporters. HK Map allows users to know what is happening in the neighborhood and take informed action. Before HK Map was founded, I anticipated there may be difficulty publishing our app due to political reasons. Along with the lack of resources to cover multiple platforms, we decided to develop our own app as a progressive web app. Our standalone app, a progressive web application wrapper, is published mostly to accommodate user habits and enable non-essential functions, caching, push notifications, and UI full screen. Being a progressive web app, our app is virtually uncensorable as long as users can access our website via any browser. Therefore, the impact of the App Store ban is not that significant, but it did discourage some less tech-savvy users, those not used to progressive web app, to use our service. Also worth to note that a third-party native app developer resigned from the project as the App Store ban made him impossible to maintain the app, plus the pressure from all the news coverage. Just a note, some suggested using Alt Store, but those who are savvy enough to use Alt Store would be able to use the progressive web app instead. Apple claims HK Map endanger law enforcement and residents in Hong Kong by allowing criminals to victimize residents in areas without providing any evidence or actual case. There was none. They also claim we violated App Store Review Guidelines number 5, legal. Apps must comply with all legal requirements in any location where they are made available. And apps that solicit, promote, and encourage criminal activity or clearly reckless behavior will be rejected, without mentioning the specific law we broke. Since the removal, we received no further communication from Apple. Yes, thank you, HK Map. So yes, so I would like to bring in Nathan to kind of like talk about all the work that you have done in terms of like the app development and the secure app development in, for example, you have worked both in the Android, iOS needs as well, and also kind of like something about what's happening right now. Especially, I think one thing that we were discussing earlier was about the Dear Apple by Astropad, which was also interesting that I wanted to raise in the discussion. But if you want to talk a bit about that to start with.
Sure. Yeah, and really happy to be here with all of these great folks who've been working so hard and making, we all just want to build useful experiences for people to run on their pocket computers. And this is a sort of absurd moment to reach where there's someone who buys a phone and you write some code and they just want to run that code on their computer phone and they can't. In the old days of say, thinking about old Windows or Mac computers, you would just download a program and hit run. And yeah, that brought with it some danger of malware, and there was nothing, you had to, do you trust this website? Do you trust the download? And Apple thought, wow, we'll do a great service to the world by getting in the middle of that, and by curating and rating and provide a trusted, beautiful retail experience for apps. And, without kind of considering this, put them right in the middle of basically restricting speech. And code is speech. And someone wants to experience your speech on their device and they're unable to. So we're not, sometimes it just sounds like, oh, my app was banned, but it's like your speech was restricted and the person who is on their own personal computer is not being allowed to run your, to experience your speech via the code. There's a very significant thing we're talking about here in terms of computing and the digital age. The other aspect of this is that, compared to Android, where yes, they have an app store, a Play Store. There's various stores: Huawei Store, Xiaomi Store, Mi Store, Baidu, GetJar, F-Droid. There's lots of, but there's built-in stores that the vast majority of the time, the user can say, hey, I just want to install this app from a download, or my friend sent me this app over email or something, and you can do it. Google says, or the Android phone will say, hey, are you really sure you want to do this? And you have to kind of confirm that, but you're able to. You're still in control. Apple, for most typical users, consumers, doesn't allow that, the side loading to be enabled. But they do for, if you're an enterprise, if you're a giant corporation, well, you have the right to do this. You have the right to control how the speech flows because you're a giant corporation, right, through enterprise distribution features. And then they have this sort of other strange feature with administrated self-signed certificates, right? And that was interesting to see that Facebook and Google were taking advantage of this to kind of get around the App Store themselves. So even these other large corporations were fed up with Apple's, sometimes said, this week-long wait, and kind of use this loophole that we can talk about more as a technical loophole. I think HKMap's use of progressive web apps is very progressive, and something that I am also a huge fan of, and I think is, again, something that can be very useful where you can actually have a native app built on a progressive web app as well. So ultimately, I've been involved in projects that are, two projects in particular, Chat Secure and Onion Browser, which were, available in the world and then banned, removed from the Chinese App Store, for one, for having encryption, and the other for, essentially evading proxies through the use of Tor, including the word Tor being scanned. We really don't know, was this detected because of keywords in the text or because they were scanning the binaries or some, third-party kind of awareness about research. But in both of those cases, it wasn't really practical to offer them through, Alt Store or, one of these other kind of less reputable app stores because we didn't trust the channel. So it is very harmful for certain kinds of apps that are focused on privacy and security to distribute through a third-party source. And while on Android, we have many, many options. for still distributing software. So yeah, so it's a struggle. And again, this is a fundamental struggle about what rights do humans have to experience speech, code as speech on their own computing devices. And Apple's really just has not done a good job while they think they're doing everything for the user.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, so to go into discussion a bit, I'm gonna. So one question that I think Nathan, you kind of touched on it a bit, right? But before we go into that, I'm just gonna ask one question to you. Something. When you're talking about like your app being blocked, right? As a developer, right? Like, so for example, you did like 3 or 4 different applications, and I believe all of them are blocked, right, on the App Store. So, and one of the things is kind of interest. For example, you did mention a bit about the processes that you saw. How opaque was it? I think because we really want to know like how transparent was all the different information that you received. Especially like I understand if it was like something. For example, Nathan was talking about the fact that with Chat Secure, it did mention the fact that it was encryption that wasn't allowed, or maybe the use of word Tor or something along those lines. What was the reasons given for all the different apps that you saw? Was it just one standard email, or was there a difference in the emails that you received?
Yeah, sure. So basically, what happened is I had almost like most of the apps that I have developed was for the Tibetan community. And if you see, for few of them, I can understand if they not understand, but I can see the logic of Tibet.net. Then there are few which they might have blocked. But the one thing which I was not able to digest was they blocked the GCM/GC apps also, which is perfectly a app for a player, a football tournament, which is known in our communication, which doesn't has any political or nothing, no information regarding that. And for all of them, they gave the same reason, saying that the information is illegal in China. That's why apps you are not able to publish in the application in the App Store. But the weird thing is, I have made another application which is a Pembo calendar, which was certainly accepted by Chinese App Store, where I have written that it's a Tibetan Pembo calendar. Might be, I think it's because it was the account was created in USA. It was a USA account in which it was censored, and we have published through that account. Might be because of that it got accepted. I can't say it's because of that, but that's the only difference I can see for now. One of others are from the India, and that was the should I say account which was opened in the USA, and that got through. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Santan. Nathan, would you like to add something to that, or especially like the 2 apps?
Yeah, I do. It's there's another aspect of challenge to Apple, and it does relate to how do we publish apps when they're censored, is the identity. So if you're an individual developer, it uses your real name as the identity on the app, backed by a government identity card of some kind, or you need to be have a business registered, and then it uses the business registration name. So it's also there's a lot of exposure. I think HKMAP said, oh, the third-party developer also didn't like the news coverage they were getting. It was hard. They quit. You're exposed because you can't really control the identity of who's publishing the app. And again, it's like those real name policy. Oh, we'll make all the app developers use their real names, and maybe take into account if they're in India or the US, they'll grade you somehow based on your name, and then they'll expose your real name. And that actually hurts you a lot as a person, as an individual, and makes this whole process difficult. So I think there's something to publishing apps under different accounts, or what's the reputation of the person publishing this app that plays into it.
Cool. Thanks, Nathan. So another question that I had, and while Nathan was speaking, I did send the question to both Charlie and HKMAP. So I'm just going to read the question first, and then get their points, and then go back to both Nathan and Samtin for your thoughts. So the question was like, I think Nathan, you touched on it a bit in the beginning, is the fact that because of the Apple's closed App Store ecosystem, which in some ways protect, in terms of laws that could protect competition, right? Because it is kind of like, I guess, like it doesn't allow you to publish it beyond the App Store. You have to do it within the App Store, right? So there has been a lot of discussions about what is the good thing about that or the bad thing about that. So there has been a lot of discussion about that, and I wanted to ask that question, and I put it out, and I have a response from HK Map on this, as well as from Charlie. So I'm going to read first from HK Map. Yes. So I'm just so everyone's clear, I'm reading. HK Map. I have mixed view regarding this. While as a developer, I hate Apple's closed system. As a person in Hong Kong, I believe the closed system has its reasons to stay. We must realize most people have a mediocre OPSEC practice, including many of the more vocal activists I have worked with. They will install any protest app without second thought from a random thread on a link. Something like HK's Reddit, I think the LIHKG, which is the Hong Kong's Reddit, kind of similar to what Reddit is. Allowing untrusted app can be very dangerous. An example that he's citing is the recent Chekra 1 and exploit.js, able to perform RCLP. Okay, that gets a bit technical, using an weaponize to target if some of those apps are allowed to go. So that was one of the statements. And from Charlie, I'm going to read Charlie's statements as well. Our end goal is to end Apple censorship. If developers make a push to break down Apple's walled garden, even for monetary reasons, then this presents an opportunities for developers who are subjected to censorship to evade this, subjected to censorship to evade the censorship. This is also an opportunity for developers of anti-censorship, religious freedom, and other sensitive apps to align with, and for example, game developers, right? So it is going to take this kind of powerful alliance to make Apple pay attention. Thanks, Charlie. Nathan, your thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about with the apps that Samten's trying to put out with for the CTA and others. Major global corporations like Google, Facebook, IBM, they do their own iOS app distribution today, right? So they enable enterprise distribution. They have 100,000 employees, and these are apps they build for their cafeteria, for vacation, their intranet management, employee stuff, and these don't have to go through Apple. And this is kind of a normal thing for corporations to use. So there is already an existing functioning system that more privileged people have access to. Why shouldn't the CTA, or Tibetan schools be able to use this same system to distribute applications directly, safely, and securely, right? So there is an approved Apple process that what we don't want, as HK Map said, is it's just, hey, download this link and then you just run it and it runs. Like Android is has caused, there's been a lot of issues with that for sure, and social engineering can cause harm where you get a text message that says, oh, tap on this. So there are already plenty exploits where you tap on a link and an iPhone can be taken over as well. So I think ultimately, right now, the mechanism exists for having alternative, secure, safe app distribution. It's just restricted to giant corporations, and that's not how it should be.
Something, do you have anything to add, or?
Sure. So for me, the why the big companies are maintaining a closed ecosystem is just to maintain their users, so that they don't go for the other application. Like the people who are using Apple, they don't want them to go to either a Nexus or any of those Pixels and all those phones. So they just want to keep the user within their ecosystem. But regarding the closed system for the application, I don't think so, because whenever the application is used nowadays, all the applications are asking for all the permissions. So like for each and every, they're asking for permissions, and you have the, if you want to, you have the authority to don't give the permissions, or but since the users are not that much aware of all these informations, they just randomly click all those buttons and give the permissions. I think that's where we as a user are lacking to read those informations and make sure that you are giving permissions only when necessary and not just click the button and just go through it.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think, Nathan, you touched a bit on the subject, and I'm going to put the question to all of you, right? It's the fact that there is that inherent risk, right? And I think that's something that I wanted to talk about, is the fact that you mentioned HK Map, you mentioned a bit about this as well, the fact that how, for security reasons, it is important for Apple to have a closed ecosystem, right? So whether it's for security, and Apple talks about privacy as one of the main reasons for having everything secure and private. So at the same time, right? But then that actually does raise the question when they censor apps and work with, for example, like this goes back to the question of, just to be very clear, like when Apple moved their iCloud data for Chinese users in 2018 to China, how is that secure and private? So I think I see a double standard here, but I wanted to talk to, like, if you can give your thoughts on this, Nathan, as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, we'll wait. Yeah, I'll start and then we'll let them chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's clearly a double standard where, I mean, let's go back to some other things that Apple has done along these lines. So for instance, you used to not, well, you still can't change the default browser, right? If you want to change a different browser, or, things like messaging, you can't replace SMS. So there's lots of things they could say, oh, that's for security. And it's like, no, it's not. It's this weird mixture of security, but also like the experience, usability or something, where they wave their hands as if like, yeah, like it's nice sometimes to like go shopping in a fancy shopping mall. The air conditioning's nice. You get a nice smoothie. There's some fancy store. You don't have to worry about the sun. There's security guards. I don't want to live there all the time, So I think that they've missed the fact that, this is where people are living their lives. And, second, I think that it's not, it also assumes that Apple is like the supreme at security. So I think the question, for HK Map and Great Fire is there's a double standard where Apple can claim security as the reason, yet they make other decisions that are often not based on security, that in fact, put users' data more at risk. So I'll stop there. And Charlie has a response
now. Thanks, Nathan. Yes, so I'm going to read Charlie's response. This is totally a double standard. Apple says one thing, but with the censorship of VPN apps in China, for example, what choices do Apple customers have left? The 100 most popular VPN apps in the US App Store are not available in China. Yet there are VPN apps that are available in the China App Store, but most of these apps are suspect and are likely tracking the activities of Apple customers. Even if they are not, most Apple customers in China probably believe that they are. So going back to Apple's statements on privacy and freedom of expression, this is actually not true in China. Chinese are treated like second-class information citizens. Thank you, Charlie. HK Map, if you have, if you have something to, please type in and I'll read it out. So Nathan, I think that goes back into like something. Would you like to add something to that, or I can bring?
No, you can proceed.
Yeah, okay. So Nathan, one thing was like, as Charlie mentioned, right, is the fact that this is a double standard. However, I think why does people? It's a weird question. Like, just to get it out, people really think that Apple is doing it for privacy and security, right? This is a very like when everyone talks about, even like when we are doing our trainings, right? And for example, when HK Map mentioned it in the beginning, right, how the closed ecosystem is really good for security and privacy, for security. I think one question is that we, as developers and also others who believe in open source, how did Apple manage to convince almost all of us that this is good? I don't know. I just wanted to kind of get it.
There's great default security, and having the primary way that you get applications be through a secure app store process is great. I mean, there's so much benefit to this, and they've done a good job of scanning and stuff and malware, but it's very similar to the right to repair issue. We love the build quality of iPhones, yet you sometimes find yourself somewhere where you need someone to be able to fix the phone without voiding your warranty. You can't always take it back to a Apple official shop, yet increasingly Apple glues the devices down to make that almost impossible to repair. So the same idea of like we had a good starting point, it's just veered off. And what's interesting is on a Mac computer, right? So Mac computers started in the old model, no app store. You just downloaded apps. Now they've started to introduce the app store, right? But imagine if they turned off the ability entirely for you to just install and run any code you'd like, that they couldn't. So I think we all want security by default. I think the point that HKMAP made is so important about most activists in Hong Kong, and we know working in the Tibetan community and others, it's that they don't have time and energy to invest in all of the decision making and is this good or not. So there's something good there, but you need that moment where you can say, now I need something different, and I want to switch to Somton's Tibetan App Store. That's where I want my apps, because I trust that source, and now I want to turn that app store on. And why can't you do that? Like, enable a trusted third-party app store.
Thank you. Charlie and HKMAP, I think, had a comment which was agrees with Charlie that Apple can always censor any app due to security concerns. So I think that's where it gets into the bit of, like, as we were talking about, like security, privacy, and stuff like that. So yeah. And another one was like, what can I say? Like, what is, like, as developers, right? What is the actual impact? Like, for example, like we were earlier looking at one of the things was like where what are some of the secure apps that are available, right, in the Chinese App Store? And traditionally, like a nation state like China would block a website from displaying, because they have the internal network infrastructure is theirs, right? So they can block any website, block any traffic to do that. How would you judge Apple's work right now in terms of, would you say they are being complicit, and actually doing the work of the Chinese government? I'm not trying to put words into any of your statements, but kind of like thinking about the truth that traditionally, like, okay, you might have an app, right? So, for example, if Signal was available, or like if let's suppose Onion browser was available in China through the Chinese App Store, they can still block it, right? They can still try to block the Tor nodes. They can still try to do all of that, which the Chinese government traditionally did. However, now it's so much easier. They don't even have to do that because they basically just kicked out the app. So in a sense, like, I'm just trying to ask all of you here is like, how complicit is that? Or is it just more like, oh, we're complying with the law? Because I think there is a fine line between complying and complicity.
I think that's an important observation, that they make the job easier, for them, when in the past it was all at the network level. I think it's a very critical key observation, and I think there are some cases, I mean, like this. It's interesting also to think about apps that maybe aren't reliant on the network, like the Tibetan calendar app that did get through the process. I mean, there's certain apps, maybe like Umbrella app, which is for activists, kind of training and teaching and safety. I don't know. So there's also this idea of, it also enables them to ban apps that are not connecting to a specific network resource. And maybe Charlie and Greatfire could talk about their browser, because that's also browsers are an interesting one, because they connect to many network resources. But it definitely makes Apple's making their job easier. I'll stop.
Thanks, Nathan. I'll read Charlie's statement. So Charlie basically says that recently there were two podcast apps which were removed from the China App Store. Apple is actually acting as the messenger or the middleman between the cyberspace administration of China and the actual developer. Why is it Apple's role to do so? That's the question. Why do you think it is important? In some of these cases, as in the case they tried to convince the podcast app developer to self-censor content to appease the Chinese authorities. And also, when Apple says that they are following the law, like they told HK Map, in many cases, developers are doing nothing legal. So I think it's more of a discussion, Nathan. I think it's similar to what Charlie is saying. Is like, why is it Apple's role to do this, right? And I think something as a developer, right? Do you have any thoughts on is it why do you think it is Apple's duty to do this, or do you think it's not? Or anyways, but just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think it's the Apple's duty to. They are acting like a firewall before the Chinese firewall for us. So it's like they are not. It's like you have studied a lot and done everything, and before you gave an exam, they are not letting you to attend the class at all for the examination at all. So that kind of situation they are bringing us for the developers. So I think Apple should at least let us put our application there, and after that, because of any network communication or something, if they censored, it's fine we at least know that we have tried our best and it went through till that time, instead of saying that okay, just before nothing happened, it was just got blocked and I can't do anything from the start itself.
Well, it's interesting also to think how far this goes, bringing the podcast app idea with taking this to HK Map Live. So and I actually don't know the history with HK Map, but imagine if HK Map was started a few years ago as your guide to inline roller skating in Hong Kong. Well, it's kind of hard to skate maybe, but your guide to fun events in Hong Kong, and it was just a real-time map for like meeting up with fun people and and knowing where to go and festivals and all of these things, right? But then it happened to be used by protesters, right? But the HK Map itself had no connection, but it was this empty vessel for content that could be. So would Apple have removed it then? And maybe that's the actual scenario, is that HK Map itself is just a generic safety tool, and it doesn't say a word about protest in the description. I'm trying to remember. So it feels like, yeah, if you build general purpose apps that just happen to be used by people to fight for their rights and to fight against injustice, then the app gets censored. Is that Apple's, if there's a podcast app and one person listens to a podcast in it that happens to be about Tibet, now that podcast app gets banned? Is that how it is?
Thank you, Nathan. Yes. So Charlie has written about. I think Charlie mentioned in his opening statement that they have built a browser app for Android, which has an anti-censorship technology built into it. They wanted people who have no experience in circumventing censorship to use it, and they have been successful in attracting this audience. But in the context of Apple, they wanted a very simple user experience for the users. Download the app, open the app, and shows a news feed of what is censored. So they just need to plug and pay, which is kind of ironic because that seemingly is what Apple says their experience is like. But in reality, Apple customers really have to jump through a bunch of hoops just to get a VPN app on their phone. So I think Charlie was kind of like talking about that. One question was like, I think, because I think in the beginning, we did discuss a bit about like HK Map was talking about how progressive web apps. And I think this is something that is coming up more and more, especially in terms of like being able to push an app, maybe even like thinking about not in the way that HK Map did it, like from a perspective of like anti-censorship, but even just a way of developing making a cross-platform. So you do a progressive web app and it's cross-platform. So you put a wrapper around it and then you push it on the iOS store or the Android store. So, but I wanted to get your thoughts, like even from you, HK Map, like what are the challenges? Because I think like there's also the understanding that how much can a progressive web app do? what are the restrictions on that, and what is it able to do and what it can't do. I think it's also really important to understand. And so even though we are talking about it as a solution for some Apple censorship, what can it do? I would just like to get your thoughts.
Should I? And I can
Yes.
in while
Yes,
they right.
Yeah, while Charlie and
well, I'll tell a little backstory, which is when the iPhone first came out, people were enraged because they said there's no apps. You can't install apps. There's no apps. There was no app store. There was no way to run third-party code. There was only web apps, right? And this is 2007. This actually goes back to when I worked at Palm, and we had something called PWAs there, which were Palm web apps, ironically enough. And then Apple brought this back. And the idea was, what if we made web apps as, that could look native and work native? Now, this is on 2G. And so it was, and the iPhone 1 and 2 were quite limited. So the odds of using the web to build native applications, things that looked, were really against them at the time. But that's come a long way now. And I think I'll pause there so we can get the comments from ATI. But yeah, so that was an original intent of Apple not to have an app store. And then people kind of forced them to have an app store. So ironically, we're back at this place, but we're in a much better place in terms of processing and connection.
So yes, I'm just going to read the statement from HKMAP. The one clear disadvantage is progressive web apps cannot access low-level functionalities such as VPNs.
Right, and just there was another question about the question. I mean, we're just discussing now what, as a way to get around App Store censorship, what can you build with web technology, really, right, as a mobile website? And progressive web apps enable your app to actually run offline, so it caches web code and runs them on the phone. It enables you to do updates in the background, some limited push notifications, but you can also do GPS location. You can do sensors. You can do camera access. You can actually do a certain amount of things. You can't access a VPN or build in a proxy. So you couldn't build the Great Fire browser as a progressive web app, but you can build something like a news app or a map app. I only use Instagram on my phone through the Instagram progressive web app. So if you want to see like what's possible with progressive web apps, try the Instagram progressive web app. It's very impressive. It does photo filtering and editing, and it looks almost like real Instagram, but it's just through the browser. So I think this is it's an interesting, for now, it's just the web. At some point, it's an interesting technology. It's not 100%, but you can do a lot.
So yes, HK Live just came out with a statement, and I'm going to ask a question based on that. HK Map says, I kind of understand how Apple as a business needs to comply with governments by not publishing illegal app under the umbrella. So yes, I think that is a question, right? Because I think I'm going to put this question broadly to everyone. Yes, I think it's very true. Like when a government is asking you not to publish an app, which is illegal, the question here is Apple pushing back? If so, how are they pushing back? And I think that is something that I just want to get all of your thoughts on. And also, I think one of the things that was discussed in the previous panel was about the fact that when people were talking about, Apple is not going to push back against China because of business interests and stuff like that. But Yakwai from Human Rights Watch raised a really interesting point, which was maybe it's not only that way, it's the other way around as well. Apple has huge business interests, but the Chinese government also relies a lot on Apple. So does Apple, like, for example, whether it's the factories that they run in China, whether it's the businesses or how many thousands of people or 100,000 of, I don't know, 10 or 20,000 of people that they employ. So it is not just a one-sided business relationship. So I think the question here is, can Apple push back? And if Apple needs to push back, what do as activists and developers need to do or to help Apple do that? I don't know, but it's a bit larger question, but I think I just wanted to get it on the radar as well. Nathan, sorry, or something. Do you want to start, or do you have any comments?
Sure. So from the Apple part, I think it's Apple is thinking in terms of business itself, and they are not taking care of anything else. So if you can see, if you see the Apple as a product itself, nowadays whatever the devices and everything is coming, there is no much improvement as it used to be when the Steve Jobs was there. So they yeah. So basically, if you see the number of devices, everything is going fine. But if you see their business, they were slowing down in some parts. So I think mostly they are pushing for the business and not for other human rights or anything other information that is more important when it comes. You have to think out of the business sometimes. So I think they are not pushing at all, from my perspective.
Nathan, before you go ahead, I'm just going to read HK Maps. I think it's kind of like HK Map and Charlie both. I think HK Map says Apple can do is provide better support for progressive web apps and third-party apps so that we can publish app without Apple's App Store, and also thereby disassociating Apple from the app, which is good for Apple as well as developers. And Charlie also writes a statement. It's like, is Apple pushing back? I think that's the question. At least that is one thing that they make clear in the transparency report. They do not push back. Almost 100% of their government app removal requests are executed. Also, Apple just says it is for legal reasons without explaining which laws are being broken. The Chinese constitution guarantees freedom of speech for its citizens. All right, Nathan, I want to
well, that brings it back to speech. Code is speech. This is what we're talking about here. Ability to experience the expression of someone else, and the ability for your expression to be experienced through code and execution of code. They need to show some, Charlie's point is excellent. They need to show some teeth. They need to show that there is some kind of realistic process. I mean, I remember with protests in China around the Beijing Olympics years ago, they said, oh, yeah, we'll allow protests. Just come and register that you're going to have a protest, and then we'll let you protest. And most of the people that went to register, they wanted to have a protest, were arrested or sent like far out of town to this like fake protest village where no one could see them. So, that's what Apple's is doing here. And again, I think, but the other point, I think, on the business front, when we talk about they're concerned about business, the specific thing they're concerned about is having their product be made unavailable for sale in China. People won't be able to buy iPhones and Macs and stuff and headphones and all this in China. Maybe they're concerned about having to move manufacturing elsewhere, but I think the bigger impact is, is shareholders, global shareholders hitting their stock because they get banned from China, right? And we saw what happened for Chinese companies in reverse. That's what we're talking about. I think there's starting to be other business calculations, and this talk, now we're getting very broad in this talk. What is business and how are they going to make money and what their brand is, and and a big thing is developers. Developer loyalty is huge, right? And Windows, Microsoft has realized this, right? Why are they building Linux into Windows? For developer loyalty, right? And why are they being so developer focused and building better developer products? Apple is really on the cusp of losing developers loyalty because of things like building terrible machines and making our lives difficult and not keeping up with modern things. So on this day of this worldwide developer conference, there's other calculations they should make for developers. And I think progressive web app support is one of these areas. If Apple becomes a premier platform for progressive web apps and things like WebRTC, and web technology works really well in a almost native experience, that's fantastic. And then they won't just get the iPhone developers, they'll get every web developer in the world will love their devices. And so progressive web apps, native web RTC support, all these things. It's like the magic solution. They could get out of the morass, this sort of tricky problem of the App Store, and they can say, yeah, but wow, look at how well we do web apps. So I hope someone there realizes this.
Okay, so I'm just going to read two things. First is from HKMap, which was surprising. Is HKMap says Apple rejected our app across all App Store region, not limited to Hong Kong and China. And he agrees that it is 100% that they are not pushing back. Charlie has a different comment on it. Is like the fact that on the business front, Apple actually needs China more than China needs Apple. China does not want these low-paying Apple jobs in some ways. China makes something like $10 from every Apple phone sold. They make nothing. Apple, on the other hand, even though they have a very small market share in China, sell half of all their phones they sell in the world in China. Apple, on the other hand, even though they have a small market share in China, sell half of all the phones they sell in the world in China. They obviously need China more than China needs Apple. And just to kind of like, I think Nathan, Charlie wants to add to what Nathan said. Nathan's point is good. If Apple wants a bigger market than China, how about Android? Attract all those customers by opening up your app store. So with that statement, I just want to bring it back into this whole thing with the Apple Developer Conference, right? One of the biggest issues or the debates that is raging is the antitrust lawsuit and about the close ecosystem of Apple and everything that is going on right now during the developers conference, right? So whether it's the Dear Apple, like from Astropad, how what is the term for it? Sherlocked, how Apple kind of like Sherlocked their app, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that, and I just wanted to ask all of you is like how with these developments, and especially with even the 30% percentage of payment or something that Apple's going to take from everything, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening, especially when Apple in some ways seems to want to close the ecosystem down even more. Is there a space for human rights activists and human rights people working on secure apps to work on these groups, work with these groups who have more of a business interest? If so, will they work with us? Because I think there is a real fear of Apple. And to be very honest, like Apple is it vengeful? I think that's a question that I just wanted to put out there. It's like, will they work with human rights developers and human rights activists, or are they afraid of reprisals or fear of repercussions? Nathan, do you want to start? And then I can go to Charlie and HK Matt.
Yeah, they're trying to. A lot of times, Apple developers remind me of people in abusive relationships. They love Apple so much, and the new phone, they pay thousands of dollars, and they get a new MacBook, and and they complain about the development tools. Oh, the Xcode upgrade is a total nightmare, but they just keep doing it, for how many years? And a lot of these folks go back multiple generations. I mean, I programmed on the Apple II, but it's really, there's a deep kind of, and the idea is that the best experience that they could ever deliver to their users would be through Apple, right? Through a Mac or through an iPhone. And so to culminate their whole life as a developer is to build the best possible iPhone app, right? That's kind of the culmination experience. And so we have to realize that mindset of that sort of motivation, when we say, so that we would be putting that at risk. There's a non-zero risk of them having an app removed or having something happen to their app or to be kicked out if they speak up too much. There's not being invited to the developers conference. I mean, there's literally stories of I wrote a bad blog about this thing and now I'm not invited to Apple events anymore, right? Even very prominent people. Or I don't get the secret inside scoops, right? So that is also real. And then there's the third piece of we're saying, well, you could build, cross-platform, progressive web apps. it's just not polished enough. It's just not smooth enough, right? And so there's a lot to dig in there of the mindset of folks that are already sort of, they're deeply invested, and I don't know if we can really count on them. I don't know how long it would take to get those folks, to think this way. I think, the idea, I wanted to go back to the idea of, there is this huge market of all the Android users, all the web users in the world. And a fascinating little side note is like Apple has basically almost lost the education market in the world to Chromebooks because they couldn't make a device that was affordable, and their web browser still can't do all this. Even on the high-end iPad Pro, people are like, yeah, I couldn't fill out my like tax forms on the web browser, right? They still can't get this right. Even for the entire education market in the US, where like all my children who've been homeschooling want is like, they just need a good web browser. Like they sit down and they do web stuff, but Apple can't even get that right because they're not willing to like make certain changes in their culture. So there's a lot of cases here where to get the kind of collaboration we all want and support, and I'm stuck, and I don't, I do this post by the Astropad developer, astropad.com blog, Dear Apple, here's how to stop. It's very promising, and it's promising to see the hey email, these big time folks like from Basecamp or Epic Games, all these big time publishers of Fortnite folks, right? So there's some that are leading the way. It's just the middle masses that we're having trouble reaching.
Thank you. Yes. So Charlie, yes, I'm going to read a statement from Charlie. I think one thing I can say is that when we started AppleCensorship.com, we knew of certain people being affected by censorship at the hands of Apple, and then as we started to build the data, then we knew that the problem was very much worse than we originally anticipated. Well, so I think in some ways, right, this kind of brings back to it's like, I don't want to keep reiterating this, but it is like similar to what Charlie's saying, like, how bad is when people start coming out, right, Nathan? For example, right, you talk about how Astropad like can stop with Sherlocking, and like how is a good way to get all of that, how to be better, right? And it's just one technology company, and like I don't know what their repercussions were, but it seems a bit like the more we have developers and people who are facing these actual issues coming out, that is the only way that we can actually move forward, because then you have I don't know what to call it, like have that kind of like a power of all the developers, because without developers, right, Apple is kind of like, without the apps, it is just a phone, right? So I think, yeah, it's just kind of like, as you were saying, right, it's interesting to see how where is the space to do that. And I think HK Map just says something. Sadly, most developers have benefits aligned with Apple as they want the China market, which is true.
Well, and for you, Samten, like there's a reason you're building, like if you can get these apps into the App Store in China, they will reach the Tibetan audience in China, right, or in occupied Tibet, right? And so there's benefit to you. Maybe you could talk about that, and also have you thought about progressive web app as a solution, or what solutions have you thought about for the apps like for Tibet.net? Or is it just too complicated with your resources?
So I think in terms of if the applications that we have built gets inside Tibet, it would be more informative about what we are doing outside, so that sometimes they don't get enough information from outside Tibet who is staying in exile, saying that we are still struggling for our freedom, and we are still working on it. So if they don't know about our struggle is still alive and still intact, they might lose their hope one day. So if we have these kind of applications going inside the Tibet, it will keep our fight alive for a very long time. So basically, regarding getting these app into the Chinese app store, as you said, the progressive web app is a good option. But if you think in terms of as you said, in Apple, there's no much way to do it apart from the Android, where they give a proper support about PWA, how to do it, and how you can, and it makes it very easy for us to go through Android also. So in that way, I guess PWA will progressive web app is a good solution for us. But in terms of the resources that we have and how we should be going through, we don't have that much knowledge of how to pass through all those gates and everything. So I guess if we need more time to dig into all these things and see what are the possible solutions, and just do a trial and error method of which are the things that might work or might not work for us.
Thanks.
I think we should build a progressive web app store app that we try to get into the app store.
So interesting.
So you install it, and then it lists all the progressive web apps as if it looks just like an app store, but they're just web apps, and then see what happens.
Yep. Nathan, you just got 2 yeses from Charlie and HK Map.
We're doing
I think, I think when you're talking about like the app, right? I think it just gave me one question that I wanted to ask all of you is like, as developers, right? When you're developing an app, especially like if you're working on human rights issues, especially in China and places like Tibet, East Turkestan, and others, right? Do you actually like in your rationale? Is an iOS app not even on your radar? Is this something that you're thinking about as for that group, or is it something like, okay, well, maybe I need it, but for example, I don't want to name an app, but one of the apps that is one of the VPN app, which is being used heavily in China, Tibet and China, don't have a iOS app because for them, I think when I spoke to the developer, he basically mentioned that it doesn't make any sense because it's going to get banned. So if more and more apps do this, I was just kind of like, and are you going to be willing to spend resources? Because I think HK Map said in the beginning, right, that the third-party app developer left because there's no role for him. So I just wanted to ask, how does that make the experience of an iOS app much worse? And as developers, is that even a priority, especially if you're going to be working in China and Tibet and places like that?
Well, let me say as an aside that the process of building a VPN app on iOS is way more complicated than on Android. It's this whole custom model called like a network extension. It has extreme limits. There's another area, where Apple says, oh, we're going to limit you to 15 megabytes of memory for your VPN app in the background, right? So things like apps like Siphon had to re-architect or Lantern, how they work, and really limit what you do on the phone, and move it all to server infrastructure. And things like Tor and other things that are really edge, peer-to-peer, edge-based kind of networks are very difficult to run. This is not done, for China, but Apple's made choices that they see as like maximizing battery life or usability, but really it makes deploying technology a lot harder. So not only is it, oh, should we build a VPN app, it'll get blocked, but like re-architecting your code to work in the iOS way is a big investment.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'm going to read a statement from Charlie. Charlie basically says, iOS has not been on our radar since 2013 when Apple censored our free Weibo app in the App Store. It actually kind of messed up for us. We have projects that are able to fight against $1 billion Chinese censorship machine. Yet in the end, it's Apple that censors us in China, not the Chinese authorities, and we have no way of getting around that. And I think that resonates something with you, what you said. Something I just wanted to like. It's the firewall before the firewall, right? So you don't even have to think about the Great Firewall of China. It's actually another firewall that is put up by Apple. Yes, and from HK Map, I think it's a real pain in the ass to publish app on App Store.
That's the summary of our session. It's a real pain.
Yeah, that's really well put.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many stories. I mean, we could just go on and on about, both just to everyday developers, to, versus to all the way the things here. And I think, when we're building like clearly activist apps, when we're working on like things that are overtly human rights oriented, and we know, that's one thing. But when you're, a developer building a podcast app, or, you're building, utility, that's when it gets frustrating. And yeah, and the point that HK Matt made just about, buying a Mac and downloading what you need for Xcode and the registration, all of these things, it's like there's a thing about privilege here, and we're talking a lot of these days about white privilege and recognizing privilege, and it is the cost of a Mac, the bandwidth you need to download the dev tools, the sort of extra knowledge you need. You can't, because it's all Mac OS based, you can't use cloud based stuff. You can't program on a cheap Chromebook. There's a lot of, the Apple way is so privileged and entitled and expensive as well, that like for people seeking justice in the world and trying to empower human rights, especially on the open source side, where you want to bring in lots of folks from California to Dharamsala to Hong Kong to Zimbabwe, like if you're building on Mac stuff, you're not really helping empower people. And so I think maybe that's my final comment here, is like, there are workarounds. We have a bunch of technical workarounds. Progressive web apps is something we should look at. But fundamentally, there's a lot of privilege that needs to be recognized if you're just sitting there saying, well, I just want to build the most perfect polished Apple thing.
Thanks, Nathan. Yes, so I want to do some final comments. And so before we wrap up, as a final wrap up, so do you have anything that you would like to add? And especially as somebody who has been working on a lot of the Tibetan iOS apps that a lot of Tibetans in the diasporas are using. So do you have anything final to add?
Sure. So from our perspective, we don't have to say that we have to develop an iOS application, irrespective of whether it gets rejected or not, because we have, as I said, almost 60% of people using the iPhone in our community. So it's like that's our entry point for us. So even though it gets rejected inside the Tibetan, in the Chinese App Store, we have other users in exiles who is using the same application to get the information. So for us, if we developing for these kind of, we have to go for the iOS, applications. And apart from that, as Nathan said, the ecosystem is very, as they said, starting from development. You need a MacBook to develop an export. There's no other way. Like if you think in terms of Android development, you can do it both on the Mac and the Windows application. So on any system you can develop an Android application. But in terms of iOS application, you need a Mac system and a Mac OS to do that. So that kind of too much of restriction is out there. So I guess that's how, at the end, I would say we need a little bit of transparency on all those stuff so that developers get more freedom of how we like to go through. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Samten. I'm going to read a statement from Charlie, his closing statements. Thanks to you for organizing this event. I think for the first time in a long time, it feels like there is some hope in fighting Apple's censorship. So many groups have spoken of the Apple injustice today. It seems like there is momentum for positive change. Thank you so much, Charlie. HK Map, if you have some statement that you would like me to read for your closing, please send it in the chat. Otherwise, please take your time. I'm just going to go to Nathan's and then come back to HK Map if they have a statement.
Yeah, this has been the day of discussions today has been really wonderful to experience, and I think the work Great Fire has done in really documenting and mapping which apps so we can understand the scope of the problem is key, and the perseverance of developers like Samten and the HK Map team is also really important to say, look, we're going to keep doing this, we're going to build it, we're going to do everything we can, either using different tools and different ways to reach our users, or just build it for the audiences we can reach. These are all key aspects, and so I think we can keep pushing things. We need people to not be afraid to be punished by Apple right? So we should have a way to push the limits and to do what we can to get around their restrictive policies and test these boundaries, both technologically through ways to get around App Store censorship and also the policy side. So we're all ears for continuing that work, and hopefully we'll be publishing some more thoughts and ideas on that to bring developers together more around courses of action. So,
thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Samten, and thank you, Charlie. I haven't received a statement from HKMap. Okay, thank you. I just received that. So let me just read that before I close. Thanks for having me here today. Not much to add, but would really hope Apple bring better support to progressive web apps. It is a promising workaround for censorship. Thank you, HKMap. So to close this session, but I just wanted to thank everyone, Nathan, Samten, Charlie, and HKMap for being on the panel. I know this was a different way of doing a panel, and it was a lot of you had to hear my voice a lot of times, which probably not the best way to do this. But thank you for bearing with us, and I just wanted to thank all of you for being on this panel. And I think the discussions around Apple censorship is a huge part, but at the same time, it's also about like how we can move forward, whether it's using progressive web apps or whether it's a third app store or whatever the solution might be, and whether it's with Apple's help or without Apple's help, or whether it's working in coalition with just us, those who work in the human rights space, or working with business interests who might have similar business interests. So there's a lot to work on, but I think there is light at the end of this. And with a lot of these, with a lot of you here, technologists who understand the ecosystem much better than all of us, and always looking for innovative solutions, I think we can get there. And yes, and I think like the first session, the first panel and the second panel today had a lot about how we can kind of like push Apple to do that. So anyways, I want to thank you all for being here. And after this, we'll go to the closing. But thank you all for being part of this panel.
Thank you. Great to see everyone. Take care.
And so, yes, thank you, everyone. And so for the closing, I'm bringing Harden back in. Hi, Harden.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. So, yes, one sec. I was just going to... Thank you so much, Harden. So for closing, right, before I pass on the baton to Harden, I just wanted to kind of like talk about talk about a bit of my own experience with Apple. So I think just to close, I just want to talk about that a bit. My personal reflection on Apple is like the first time I actually heard about Apple, and I didn't know much about it, was when I saw the photo of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, in their Think Different campaign. And it was a photo that I saw, and I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And it was an ad campaign. And so when I saw that photo and when I was preparing for this panel and conference, I actually did a bit of a research on what that image was and what the tagline was. So let me read the tagline of what that campaign, which was launched in 1997, was. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world usually do. Okay, so that was the tagline in the 1997 campaign. So I'm going to read another tagline, which my colleague Harden, actually you mentioned it in your opening statement, which was the letter that CEO Tim Cook sent to Apple employees. At Apple, our mission has and always will be to create technology that empowers people to change the world for the better. And the similarity is about changing the world, which is really interesting. And so now to go on to the censorship part of it, the 1997 campaign, which was used with the photo of His Holiness and other eminent personalities, was used all over the world, except the photo of His Holiness was removed in China and Hong Kong for the sensibilities of the Chinese citizens or whatever you want to call it. And it was just the photo and Think Different, nothing else. Okay. And if you look at the market of Apple at that time in China, they just sold 10,000 Macintosh and notebooks. Only 10,000 computers were sold in China at that time. And the market right now, if you look at it, like just for iPhones, is around 228. That was in 2017. It's probably more than that, but that is the market that they have in China. So it does kind of tell us, like, shows us what Apple is doing, but at the same time, it also shows how much work we have to do. Because if Apple was willing to do something in 1997, where their market was like probably not even worth the campaign, I don't even know. But now the market is actually worth a lot more. So I think I think, is kind of like understanding where we are is really important, and to change it, what do we need to do? I think it's also important. So, but I think kind of like I just wanted to bring it together and say, like, recognizing the fact that Apple is huge and their market in China is huge and there is an impact. So we do have to recognize how big that is and work towards that. And not to say that, oh, just because they are big that we can't, but just recognizing it's not going to be a simple battle. I think that's what I wanted to share. And kind of like give a bit of the final highlight I want to say is, like, we had 2 hackathons today where we had like experts in research, advocacy, people who understand technology, who have done great research globally, to discuss about how can we understand more about the opaque nature of Apple and how it actually works in China. So we'll continue doing this work. And now I'm going to pass it over to Harden to close the event, to close the day.
Thanks, Lobsang. I am, yeah, it's what an inspiring event. And, you know, from the morning, so we had the 3 panels and the hackathons. And from the morning panel, which I hosted, you know, first thing on a Monday morning, it's a great way to start the week. We had just a fantastic discussion looking at censorship in China historically under the Chinese Communist Party and till now, and looking at how it used to be about trying to help people. It used to be just solely about how we can support Tibetans, Chinese, others inside China or in Chinese controlled areas, territories, how we could help them break through the Great Firewall and get around censorship and away from Chinese government surveillance. And now, you know, we had a journalist this morning from The Intercept who just published an incredible, stunning report on TikTok. And, you know, if you think about WeChat and TikTok and how that censorship has now, I mean, it's not just about people in China or Tibet or East Turkestan or wherever using apps that, or you know, being subject to censorship there, but it's the reach now that the Beijing regime, the Chinese Communist Party, this authoritarian regime now can reach all of us and censor us in the free and open societies that we live in if we're using tools like communication tools like TikTok or WeChat that are based there, or how Apple, a company that is based on this side of the world, is actually doing the Chinese government's bidding. And so they're benefiting from this free and open society here, and all the creativity and all the think different and everything they want to say and can say, they pay lip service to at least. But there's this unethical double standard that really is life and death for people inside China and Tibet, as Xiao from China Digital Times pointed out today, that when people can't get access to a safe VPN inside of China, Tibet, and East Turkestan and beyond, then they are subject to surveillance, and they are subject to, they're not safe what they're trying to do to live their lives, to do their business, to speak their minds. They're not safe, and they can end up in prison and, you know, tortured. They could pay the ultimate price with their lives And all that starts because Apple is at the behest of the Chinese government removing these trusted VPN apps out of the App Store, taking those tools away from people. So anyway, the second panel was really the voices of people impacted, from the communities impacted on the ground, from Hong Kong, from East Turkestan, Tibetans, people, the censorship affects real people and impacts the daily lives, the freedom, the safety and security of millions and millions of people on the other side of the Great Firewall. And their voices are absolutely critical to be heard and we have to be constantly amplifying them so that Apple and other corporations understand the actual impact of their decisions, their policy choices, and their lack of courage, I would say, in dealings with the Chinese government today, in doing business in China. And of course, we just had the closing of this developers panel, looking at workarounds and options for when Apple, the Chinese App Store, censors the developers. And I really find, on the one hand, there's this idea that we have to keep trying because so many people are using, certainly in the Tibetan community, so many people, 60%, I think, something said, are using Tibetan community are using Apple products. And so, we have to keep pushing for change. At the same time, as Nathan is always a voice for, we have to also look for creative solutions within and outside of that world of Apple. But in this case, if I can just wrap things up by saying that as bad as things are, as crazy as this world is right now, the news from China breaking every day, the tension in the world, the people in Hong Kong fighting for their freedom and their rights, and Tibetans inside Tibet, Uyghurs inside East Turkestan, where there are actual concentration camps with more than 1 million people in them, Tibetans who live in a virtual blackout. We have almost no news out of Tibet. That's how efficiently and successfully China has shut down almost communications and travel and whatnot to Tibet. And Chinese, of course, citizens themselves who courageously, as we've seen through the coronavirus outbreak and through history, Chinese citizens and netizens are constantly resisting and risking their lives and giving their lives to fight for their rights and freedom. And so the situation is difficult, and a company like Apple has an outsized influence and ability to help, and yet so often we see them actually hurting and not helping and not supporting the people, and in fact helping China erode global norms on freedom of expression and privacy, which is what our campaign in part is trying to, enough is enough, we're trying to stop. But this work is hard. We keep doing it, and we are seeing progress. And what I wanted just to end on is the positive note that the Stop Apple Censorship campaign just this year put a shareholder resolution at Apple's AGM, basically an activist shareholder resolution that the company tried to shut down. They were forced to allow it. And it was saying that the board at Apple needs to prepare an annual report and come clean and come clear on exactly what requests they get from governments and third parties related to freedom of expression and access to information, where they might be or are being asked to make decisions that could impact freedom of expression and access to information. And that shareholder resolution got just over 40% support. So while it did not pass, that number of just over 40% support was a huge indicator that there is an appetite for change amongst shareholders and globally as it pertains to, in particular, Apple's behavior in China and vis-a-vis the Chinese government, and vis-a-vis freedom of expression and privacy. These, security and privacy that are what Apple sells itself on and pays plenty of lip service to. But they actually are not clear or accountable to what exactly is going on behind closed doors. What are they actually doing and saying when they're pushed, or when they are proactively shutting down, removing apps from the App Store, or whatever it might be, censoring Apple TV, who knows? So for that resolution to get 40% support is just incredible. A typical activist shareholder resolution, I believe, gets like in the single digits, is expected to get, I forget, 6 to 12% support. That would be a lot. So 40%, that was a clear message to Apple that it's time for change and people want more from them. And I think this campaign can move. We have an obligation to work on behalf of those people inside China, Tibet, and East Turkestan, Hong Kong, who are valiantly, Southern Mongolia, I should say, who are valiantly and courageously fighting for their right to be free and fighting for their basic rights. We have an obligation to work for them. We will work for them. This is not easy, but it's also, we live in we have incredible resources, living in freedom with these rights that we can speak out and can do these things, can hold. Maybe we can't directly hold the Beijing government accountable, but we can certainly work to hold the Apple and other corporations, not just Apple, accountable in a way that sends a message to Beijing that we won't take any more of this, that they absolutely cannot continue on their path to erode global human rights, and that we are going to speak up for people inside, on the other side of the Great Firewall, people on the ground who face the repression and their surveillance and their targeted attacks every day, and that this coalition is just building strength and power, and Apple will have to answer to us and to, I hope, growing numbers of their own employees, developers who are a part of their worldwide developers conference today. And they're, most importantly, I think, their users and their customers. They will have to answer to us because we're not going away, and we're going to work to build the grassroots pressure that will force a change, whether Apple likes it or not. And I think it's just what we're going to do. It may not be easy, but I think we've already made great headway, and I think it's our obligation. I think it's a privilege to be able to work on this campaign and work for these communities. And I look forward to, hopefully, people who are inspired by this day, or the solutions, the ideas that came out of this day, that we together can move forward to the next phases of this campaign. And I think change is coming. I think we can all feel it. There's so much new awareness and understanding that the Beijing regime does not speak for, certainly not Tibetans or Uyghurs, or represent their best interests, let alone their own people, Chinese citizens who want to have rights and freedom, who want to be able to talk about public health without living in fear for their lives or their safety or security, that they have every right to enjoy the same rights we have here, and Apple's Tim Cook enjoys living in the United States of America, and that no government, no company can deny them that. And so that's my long closing, but thank you, everyone who's been a part of this wonderful day. And thanks to everyone who organized it and worked so incredibly hard. And we'll do more in the future. And we hope that the Worldwide Developers Conference over at Apple heard our voices. We'll be sure to send them a lot of the outcomes and make sure they hear our voices in the future as we continue this campaign on. We're not going anywhere. We're just going to get stronger. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.